For the last decade, I've done a lot of lectures and panels at different events, covering topics from my history book to deconstruction in the narrative arts. More recently, I started to present panels that go into the psychology and history of transformation and shapeshifting in fiction. But there's a specific niche of the subgenre I have taken interest in that has taken me a while to feel comfortable to discuss publicly. This is the topic of inanimate transformation, wherein a person transforms into an object or inorganic form. There is a sliding scale I have made of what can be considered inanimate transformation, or Inanimate TF. But for our purposes, when I discuss the matter, I am referring to ones in which the subject being transformed still retains their sentience, whether they still have the ability to move or are immobile in that form. I have recently taken this specific topic and presented full lectures looking into the history of inanimate transformation in fiction, from old mythology and cautionary fables to its evolution in modern fiction and media. I have been meaning to turn this into a video essay, but always hesitated as the subject matter may be seen as alienating, and I want to save this for the future when I felt more confident in my abilities to produce video essays. However, within minutes of seeing the first episode of this new anime Gleipnir, wherein the entire premise surrounds this theme, I felt motivated to tackle this as my first video topic. Specifically, this is because I noticed a lot of narrative tropes tackled in this first episode more mirror ones that were developed within the online transformation communities and rarely addressed in published media. Online, there are communities of transformation and shapeshifting fans. Yet, inanimate transformation is only a sliver of this small niche. When one mentions inanimate transformation, it's often met with confusion and hesitation, even within these communities. This is mainly due to inanimate transformation in published fiction having the unintended consequence of becoming nightmare fuel or fringe horror. And for those who are introduced to inanimate transformation online, it's normally posted on cringe websites. To be fair, some of it can be seen as cringe out of context. However, it's a topic I do enjoy and will be willing to suffer through, even with the nightmare fuel and cringe, because I think it opens a lot of room for unique storytelling opportunity. Sadly, most inanimate transformation in fiction is very, very sparse. It's normally only used as a curse or punishment, as a one-off gag, or something that happens to background characters who have very little role in the stories. In most cases, the mindset of those transformed is hardly expanded on, despite there being a lot of storytelling potential within these ideas. Within animal transformation, there are stories that could be explored, specifically regarding the mindset of those who have been transformed. From the primal feeling of power werewolves get, to the human mind finding the instincts of a new animal form, to the feeling of a lower status when being reduced to a vermin, or even the mindset that comes with being owned when someone is transformed into an animal that is later adopted as a pet. Inanimate transformation can offer an equal amount of storytelling potential. This is rarely explored in published fiction. However, within the online community, there has been a growing creative niche that has represented inanimate transformation in art, comics, and stories where these elements are explored. In fact, a lot of tropes and elements I've seen within these online works I've not seen addressed or brought up in mainstream fiction. However, I do see some present within this anime. So I'm going to try to go over some of these specific elements I've picked up while watching this first episode. For this, I'm going to gloss over most of the plot elements and anime tropes and only address tropes that are specific with inanimate transformation stories and artwork. In the show, the shapeshifter refers to his form as a mascot, when we know he's basically just a fursuit. So that's why I'll be comparing him to fursuit transformation, which is actually a growing niche within the furry side of the transformation community. I admit I've drawn some fursuit transformation in the past. So let's look at our first transformation scene. Within the TF community, transition sequences have become the focus and normally the central point of a lot of visual art. Being able to see a character slowly transition from one form to another. You may be accustomed to the Animorph book covers, which has popularized this portrayal of transformation sequences, along with being a meme status in its own right. Along with portraying transformation in these linear sequences, a lot of online artists make use of comics and the elements of panel-by-panel narrative to express different elements within this transition. This can lead to a lot of unique gags and twists. So for example, you might read a comic and start thinking it's about a guy slowly transforming to a werewolf, only to reach the end and realize, oh, he's just transformed into a small dog. This anime expresses the same gag. So here in this scene, we see a lot of specific elements of our protagonist's transformation. It starts off mirroring a lot of common elements we're familiar with when werewolves are portrayed in media. Focusing on elements like the fur, teeth, and claws reinforce imagery of a werewolf, only for the bigger view to show he's not some monstrous beast, but a cute living fursuit. Within the inanimate community, this is a frequently recurring trope, with characters who are trying to transform into something fierce like a dragon, only to wind up changed into a dragon pool toy instead. The next element that's popular within the TF community is what's normally called the post-transformation reaction. This is the case where someone who's just been transformed, maybe out of the blue, caused by a curse or accident, realizes that they're in a new body and slowly has to adjust to this new unfamiliar body. In the case where the person willingly transforms, but winds up in a form they're not accustomed to or still trying to get to know, there's normally an expression of shock. This is what we see here in this anime. Like with those online comics where the character intends to be something fearsome, but ends up being something cute, we have an element of confusion here where our protagonist reacts in a very similar way. And based on his reaction, we could tell that his ability to transform is something relatively new that he's still trying to comprehend. This is an element that's often omitted in most published work. For example, when we look at the introduction of protagonists from shows and works like Turbo Teen, Teen Bolt, and Soul Eater, we are introduced to them after they have already grown accustomed to their new abilities. We miss the first reaction. In regards to inanimate transformation, in most cases the character's reactions are glossed over or ignored, normally writing them off as being unaware or unconscious during the transformation. In fact, the children's book Sylvester and the Magic Pebble is one of the few times the audience actually gets to know the mindset of the character after a transformation scene. This type of insight is what the transformation community online actually enjoys and wants to focus on. So for example, if you look up most Turbo Teen fanfiction, they normally cover the character Brett reacting to his transformation to a car for the first time. This completely changes the narrative story being told from how his abilities are portrayed on the show, where he's already used to transforming to a car. This is especially common within inanimate art and comics, where the character's reaction to being turned into a stuffed animal is a common subject matter. We see our protagonist reacting to his form in a way that's more common with these online portrayals, yet often omitted in most published media. Now we see him trying to collect himself and focus on the mission at hand. He is the one with the power here, yet he is still mentally battling the confusion in which his power manifests, something I wish was more addressed in superhero comics. In most comics, when we have a character who take on an inanimate form, like Stoneboy from Legion of Superheroes or Zan from the Wonder Twins, they're portrayed as gag characters, given no room for depth or inner thoughts, because their only existence is for comedic effect. Any deeper thoughts into their frustration with their unique abilities would ruin that comedic purpose. Even in the more acclaimed Teen Titans TV show, when Beast Boy was turned into a lamp, the moment he was instantly downgraded to being nothing more than a prop for the other characters to use. One of the closest examples I've seen to properly addressing this is actually from the Marvel comic Power Pack with regard to the character Jack Powers, also known as Maskmaster. Within the first issue of Power Pack, we see Jack gaining his superpowers, and already we see his frustration and jealousy over his siblings who have far superior powers, like the ability to control gravity, light, and energy, while all he can do is just turn to a cloud. By issue 3, which I actually have here hung on my wall, Jack laments his power and vents to his siblings that he's been quickly pushed to a position of being nothing more than a cloaking device for his siblings. His frustration intensifies when the villains of the comic kidnap his siblings, but leave him behind because they consider his powers ineffective. Jack finds himself needing to save his siblings alone, yet the entire time he is still dealing with the mental anguish of how lame his powers are, and trying to justify them, only to realize, yes, they are less impressive than other abilities, but that's all he has to work with, and he needs to use them to save his family. This is what our protagonist in the anime is going through. He's going through a very similar mental fight. He's questioning the awkward form in which his powers manifest, but he has to keep telling himself this is the only way he can rescue the girl from the burning building. Now we see what's called a Revert Transformation, basically when the shapeshifter turns back to the original form. Continuing the discussion of transformation sequences, they are very hard to represent in visual form. The most successful attempts I've seen are represented in prose, because with live-action film, it is very hard to portray, and even with cartoons, becomes very tricky to animate. This is the reason live-action shapeshifting, like in the Animorphs TV show, or Gar in Titans, normally cut away during the actual transformation, only showing the end results. Same with the servants from the live-action Beauty and the Beast. Speaking of which, it's very obvious to most viewers that the servants in the live-action version have an uncanny look and don't hold a candle to their animated counterparts. This brings up the next issue of why transformation sequences tend to be avoided in most fiction, the unintended horror feel. This is especially the case when the transformation is between human and objects, specifically objects with no anthropomorphic features. Even when the character becomes an object that have elements that could correspond to different human body parts, like a car, there is still an unintended tinge of horror. As for our protagonist here, even though his other form is very humanoid, we still get a sense of nightmare feel if we slow down or pause his transformation sequence. With this next scene, we see our next narrative trope common with online transformation fiction. Being caught on camera while in the middle of transforming or post-change. This is specifically very common with inanimate stories online, in which a character witnessing the transformation take place normally tries to take a picture of the transformed person. Let's say a person transforms into a t-shirt. His friend might take a picture of him in shirt form and tease him by saying he will post it online and tag him as such, so everyone knows he is now transformed. In more lighthearted stories, this adds an element of comedy and humiliation to the transformed person. In other cases, it can lead to blackmail, as we see in this episode. Another trope that I'm very fond of, that is very common with online transformation fiction and stories, is the shapeshifter realizing he might be seen by others. In the case of inanimate transformation, if they still have the ability to move, it results in them either trying to hide or go lifeless and play the role of an ordinary object. Similar to how the toys in Toy Story react when humans are around. Now with this series, I'm not sure if our protagonist, when he transforms into a mascot, could go lifeless and look empty like a normal fursuit. However, in regards with his unique appearance, it would still raise some questions, so of course he's going to take the option to hide. Now with him hiding here, he starts expressing different emotions. You could see he was angry in the previous scene, and now he's more worried and cautious in this scene. This brings up the Lex element, which I theorize purely came from the online transformation community, or at least was popularized there. This is why I like to call the goofy, permanent grin with object expression. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, when artists were developing the concept of pool toy transformation, they would normally portray these pool toys with big, wide grins. In most cases, it's because the smile was a painted-on element of this new body, and not a functioning mouth. These new pool toys would be stuck with that one expression on their face, regardless of what emotions were going on in their minds. Of course, once the subject has been transformed into something like a pool toy, their natural reaction would be shock, confusion, or embarrassment. To portray these emotions, the artist would try different techniques, like overlapping existing anime expressions to this frozen face. For example, to show embarrassment, they might add bright pink blush over their cheeks. To show awkwardness, they might add a sweat drop. These mixed reactions of fear or worry over a frozen grinning face adds a new unintended layer of cuteness for fans of such artwork. This technique has been used so often within the online transformation community that nowadays such artists can simply draw blush or sweat drops on a normal object, and fans would instantly recognize this as a post-inanimate transformation. We see this element represented here in this episode in regards to the mascot face, which wears a big permanent toothy grin, yet can still produce awkward sweat drops and blush. The second technique to show expression in a transformed in a visual is to overlay their human form, either as a thought bubble or a transparent overlay over the current form. This is a great way to express human emotions and inner thoughts when looking at an object body. We see this well represented here. In regard to this protagonist as a whole, I notice he shares many features in common with characters who are normally central to inanimate transformation art and fiction. Normally the person who's being transformed into an object is a wimpy or scrawny guy who's already easily ignored or submissive, like this protagonist here, who seems to be an awkward, nerdy high school kid. One of the final things I want to address here is while the series seems to make use of a lot of elements and narrative tropes that are more common with online transformation, it seems to also subvert some of these portrayals. So let's look at online portrayals of fursuit transformation. So to give you a quick rundown of how fursuit transformation is portrayed online, just know it had its roots in both plushie and clothing transformation. So specifically in regards to clothing transformation fiction, most of the story elements come from the awkwardness of being worn. In these cases, normally the character is portrayed as antisocial and is now forced into a position where they need to come into close contact with another person. In other stories, these characters sometimes now have an urge to be worn once transformed into a clothing form. Normally this is explained as a character now lacking a rigid body or support, or having a feeling of emptiness or hollowness, so they need to be filled with a wearer to finally feel whole again. This often becomes a metaphor for a character who needs a supportive friend or partner to help them during rough times. Of course, this could lead to other more not safe for work implications, and it has in some Japanese media, but I will address that elephant in the room at another time. Just know in the cases I'm specifically using here for comparison, these transformations can be portrayed as a person losing power or the ability to support themselves, being put into a now helpless or dependent position, or becoming a metaphor to express comfort, usefulness, and supportive contact with friends in a safe manner. These elements carry over to fursuit transformation art and comics. In these cases, the final result has a new fursuit plopping down helplessly to the ground, where they can't move until someone decides to pick them up and wear them. In contrast to this, another side of the transformation community has taken this concept of a living suit and added an element of power. From this perspective, the living suit now gains new abilities and actually seeks out wearers, not because they need support, but because they want to lure them like prey to engulf or absorb them. In other cases, sometimes these living suits might use the person who is inside them like a muscle puppet so they can move around easier. This borrows heavily from fiction surrounding slime creatures who can absorb and control their victims. In this anime, we see that there's a hybrid approach to this. In this case, our wimpy protagonist is now granted with immense strength in mascot form, yet he is still mentally weak and confused on how to use his abilities. We see that even though no one is currently inside him, he still has the ability to move on his own, and he still has a rigid form. Though we will see in later episodes, he has the ability to unzip himself and allow others to wear him and control him like a mecha suit. But even with this case, we see that there is more of a mixed element between these two narrative routes, where such a transformation can be represented as both helpless and powerful. I hope to the general public this introduces you to the concept of inanimate transformation beyond the assumed horror feel. If there is more interest, I would really like to go into the history of the evolution of inanimate transformation in fiction, from old mythology to the modern day, and how the perception of this topic keeps changing. For my friends in the transformation community, I hope I presented a respectful portrayal, even if simplified and quickly glossed over. This was my first test video essay, the main body of which was scripted and recorded in under 12 hours within watching this anime on release day, which inspired this attempt. The rest was about a week of work, learning how to use Lightworks for my first time, and putting this all together, so I apologize if the audio and video is not as strong. This is a very big transition for me, from my live panels and lectures at events where I'm in person, and my podcasts where I go ad lib without a script. So I worry my voice sounds too much like I'm reading. Hopefully in future episodes, I will feel more confident in my audio recordings. Before I go, I want to thank my friend Simo, who I have done podcasts with in the past, for his assistance in teaching me how to do video editing, as well as my friend Frederick, who does the Down the Rabbit Hole YouTube channel, for his advice and giving me motivation and support to finally follow through with this project. If you want to see more of my stuff, you can check me out on Twitter at TransformARTive, and I hope within the next month to produce some new video essays on topics ranging from the legacy of Alan Moore's Watchmen to Scientology's attempt at making a blockbuster film. Thank you very much for watching TransformARTive, and remember to shift your perspective.